Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are immersing ourselves in, well, arguably the most comprehensively studied conflict in human history, the Second World War.
It really is. The sheer volume of material archives, analyses, personal accounts, it's just immense. You start pulling on one thread, say, a single battle, and you quickly find yourself tangled in this vast, interconnected web.
Absolutely. And the sheer scale of it, all the battles, yes. But also the politics, the economics, the staggering human costs, it can be overwhelming.
Absolutely.
So our mission today, our goal for this deep dive is really to cut through some of that complexity. We want to provide you with the essential core insights from this mountain of research. We're deliberately stepping back from just a chronological rundown of battles, though obviously events are important. Instead, we want to focus on the central transformation that really defined this era.
It is.
How World War II fundamentally changed the very nature of conflict itself. How it evolved from, more traditional, maybe contained warfare into this all-encompassing, boundaryless struggle, what we now call total war.
Grasping that transition, that shift, is absolutely crucial to understanding not just the war, but the entire 20th century that followed.
Right.
We really need to examine the precedents, some shocking moral and military precedents that were actually established in the decades before 1939. Then there's the unprecedented economic mobilization, how nations literally turned their entire economies into war machines.
And the specific horrors, the targeting of civilians, that blurring of lines.
Exactly, that blurring between combatant and non-combatant.
Yeah.
And finally, yes, the terrifying technological climax, the atomic bomb, which ended the war but simultaneously kicked off the nuclear age.
Okay, so let's start right there, that distinction, this concept of total war. What exactly is it, and how is it fundamentally different from, say, the wars that came before?
Well, at its core, total war means war without limits. No limits on the means used, no limits on the goals pursued.
So unlike older conflicts.
Precisely. Historically, even massive wars tended to have certain boundaries, let's say. Armies generally fought other armies. Objectives were often limited, maybe gaining some territory or deposing a specific ruler.
And civilians, they obviously suffered terribly, but they weren't usually the main target, not in the way we see later.
Not in the same systematic, industrialized way, no. They were often caught in the crossfire, victims of siege or famine, but not typically the explicit strategic target for annihilation by, industrial systems of destruction.
It sounds a bit like a concept that the Prussian military thinker, Karl von Clausewitz, talked about long before this, didn't he?
He did, yes. But interestingly, he approached it more as a theoretical extreme, almost a warning. Back in the 1820s, Clausewitz developed this idea of absolute war.
Absolute, yeah.
For him, it was the logical endpoint of conflict. You pursue an unlimited political objective. What's that objective? The total destruction of the enemy state, the complete eradication of their independence.
Which, when you look at the ambitions of the Axis powers in WWII, annihilating Soviet communism, carving out Lebensraum, achieving Japanese dominance in Asia, that sounds exactly like the kind of unlimited, absolute objective Clausewitz was describing.
It aligns perfectly. But here's the fascinating part, the crucial difference. Clausewitz himself actually argued that this kind of absolute war was unlikely, maybe even impossible in reality.
Why did he think that?
He believed the sheer political will, the immense societal strain required to pursue such total destruction, would actually cause the societies doing the fighting to collapse internally before they could achieve that ultimate goal.
So he couldn't foresee the power of the modern state.
Exactly. He hadn't accounted for the rise of the massive, centralized, industrialized nation-state in the 20th century. These states had the bureaucratic power, the economic infrastructure, the propaganda tools to absorb and direct that immense strain in ways Clausewitz couldn't have imagined.
So if Clausewitz thought it was impossible, World War I must have been a real shock to the system, a kind of wake-up call.
Oh, absolutely. WWII was the terrifying trial run. It gave us trench warfare, slaughter on an industrial scale, poison gas, the need for total state control over production and manpower.
And wasn't it a German general from WWI who actually coined the term total war?
It was General Erich Ludendorff. During WWI, he used the term total war to describe precisely that the unprecedented level of state mobilization needed just to survive years of industrialized attrition warfare.
But WWI only sort of hinted at the potential, right? It was WWII that really delivered the catastrophic reality.
Precisely. WWII fully realized the concept. The totalitarian states, particularly Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, but others too, were capable of mobilizing their populations, their economies, their science, their very ideologies, on a scale that shattered all previous restraints.
So the key features become
An existential struggle. It's framed as survival versus annihilation. And because the stakes are seen as existential, there's this crucial belief that emerges. Any method, absolutely any method, no matter how brutal, no matter how previously illegal or immoral, becomes legitimate if it helps achieve victory.
And once you accept that premise,
You strip away all the traditional boundaries of conflict. The line between soldier and civilian evaporates. And critically, as you mentioned, this moral degradation, this acceptance of brutality, it didn't just suddenly appear in 1939. It incubated. It evolved gradually throughout those interwar years.
which takes us right into our first big section, the incubation of total war. Because the failure of that post-World War I international system, it basically created a kind of testing ground, didn't it?
A perfect way to put it, a testing ground where aggressive powers learned, step by step, that they could normalize brutality, that they could break international rules with minimal real consequences from the international community.
And that post-WWII system, it was largely built on the League of Nations, wasn't it? Woodrow Wilson's idealistic vision.
Yes, based on the core idea of collective security, an attack on one member state would be considered an attack on all. Noble idea.
But fatally flawed from the start.
Fatally crippled, you could say.
Wow.
The single biggest structural weakness was the refusal of the United States Senate to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. That meant the U.S., the world's rising economic and potentially military giant, never actually joined the League.
So a system designed for collective security, needing great power enforcement, was missing its most important potential enforcer.
Exactly. It lacked the teeth it needed from day one. So when the first major act of naked aggression happened in Asia back in 1931, the League was essentially powerless. Let's talk about Manchuria.
Okay, Japan and Manchuria in 1931.
This is absolutely the clearest early signal that the international rule of law was crumbling. What's often missed is that this invasion wasn't even fully sanctioned by the civilian government in Tokyo initially.
Really?
It was largely driven by the Japanese Kwantan Army stationed in Manchuria. They were acting independently, almost forcing the hand of their own government, testing the limits of their own state, and, well, testing the world's reaction.
And the excuse they used, the pretext for the invasion, wasn't that completely manufactured. Something about a railway explosion.
Utterly manufactured. A small, staged explosion along the Japanese-owned South Manchurian Railway near Mukden. Blamed on Chinese dissidents, but carried out by junior Japanese officers to provide the justification.
Chemical.
Extremely.
Yeah.
And within days, the Japanese military rolled in and occupied huge swaths of Manchuria, a massive, resource-rich region, bigger than France and Germany put together. It was a precursor to blitzkrieg, really speed, decisive force against a weaker, less industrialized opponent.
So the League of Nations steps in, investigates. What happened?
They investigate, yes. The Lytton Commission publishes a report, labels Japan the aggressor, but tangible action, almost nothing.
Fine.
The major European powers, Britain and France, were still reeling from WWII, deep in the Great Depression. They were completely unwilling to risk a conflict, especially over a region so far away. Economic sanctions were discussed, but never seriously implemented.
So Japan faced no real consequences.
Practically none. When the League formally censured Japan based on the report, Japan's response was simply to reject the findings and, in March 1933, walk out of the League altogether.
The message that sent must have been crystal clear to anyone watching, especially other ambitious powers.
Unmistakable. Aggression works. International condemnation means little without enforcement. Moral boundaries can be violated without serious military or economic cost.
And that lesson wasn't lost on Benito Mussolini in Italy, was it?
Not at all. Just 2 years later, October 1935, Mussolini takes that lesson and applies it much closer to Europe, in Africa, with the invasion of Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia.
This felt like pure, almost theatrical imperialism from Mussolini, trying to recreate a Roman Empire vibe.
It absolutely was. Part performance, part brutal conquest. He deployed a huge army, determined to make a big fascist statement. The League condemned it again, imposed some sanctions.
But were the sanctions effective this time?
Ludicrously ineffective. They banned exports like mules and camels to Italy, but crucially failed to ban the shipment of oil, cars, trucks, the things essential for a modern military campaign.
Why the half-hearted measures?
Well, Britain and France were still major imperial powers themselves. They found it awkward, perhaps, to muster the full moral authority to tell Mussolini he couldn't grab an empire. They even tried to broker a secret deal, the Hoare-Laval Pact, that would have essentially given Mussolini most of Ethiopia anyway. It leaked, caused a scandal, but showed their reluctance to really confront him.
But beyond the diplomatic failures, there was a crucial turning point here in terms of how the war was fought. This specific total war element that really stands out.
Yes. This is the pivotal, horrifying development in Abyssinia. On December 26, 1935, Mussolini personally authorized the use of chemical weapons, specifically mustard gas.
Delivered how?
By artillery shells, but also, crucially, sprayed from aircraft. And this wasn't just aimed at enemy soldiers on a battlefield. It was used intentionally against civilian populations. Villages, livestock, vital water sources were deliberately targeted and drenched in poison gas.
So they were actively, consciously obliterating that moral boundary, the one that supposedly protected non-combatants, a line that was, at least on paper, respected even during the horrors of WWI's gas attacks.
Precisely. They weren't just breaking the rules, they were demonstrating contempt for the rules. And when the horrific evidence emerged, the pictures, the reports of civilians suffering these terrible, blistering chemical burns, Mussolini had the audacity to deny it completely.
And what was his explanation?
He claimed the injuries were just symptoms of leprosy endemic to the region, an outrageous lie. And because the Western democracies, particularly Britain and France, were terrified of pushing Mussolini closer to Hitler and refused to risk a wider war over Ethiopia, they effectively, tacitly connived in the cover-up.
So the lesson here was even darker than Manchuria.
Much darker. It demonstrated that unrestrained violence, including chemical weapons against civilians, was now normalized. If you were powerful enough, you could get away with it. Civilians were now unequivocally fair game, a legitimate part of military strategy.
So by the time the Spanish Civil War breaks out in 1936, the international community has already shown its weakness, and the aggressors have learned that brutality pays. Spain becomes, what, a dress rehearsal?
A brutal, bloody dress rehearsal for the larger conflict to come. It was an incredibly complex war, fueled by deep ideological divides, left versus right, fascism versus communism, regional separatism versus central control, and civilians were immediately caught in the middle, not just as victims, but as suspected enemies.
And this is where we get that term fifth column, right?
Yes, coined by the nationalist general Emilio Mola. As his forces advanced on Madrid, he boasted he had 4 military columns attacking from the outside, but also a 5th column of secret supporters already inside the city, ready to rise up and undermine the Republican defense from within.
That concept itself just speaks volumes about the breakdown of trust, the blurring of lines. Everyone is a potential enemy.
Exactly. And Spain also became the tested ground for military technology and tactics, particularly for Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy, who backed Franco's nationalists.
This is where the Luftwaffe got its practice, trialing the blitzkrieg tactics.
Invaluable combat experience. They tested new aircraft, tanks, communication systems, and critically developed the doctrine of fast, concentrated air and mechanized ground attacks designed to shatter enemy lines and morale.
And the most infamous example of that testing was the bombing of Guernica.
Guernica, April 1937. Immortalized, of course, by Picasso's painting, it became the global symbol of terror bombing against a civilian center.
What actually happened there?
The German Condor Legion, flying in support of Franco, deployed concentrated air power against this small Basque town. It wasn't a major military target. They used waves of bombers, 3 squadrons operating in coordinated 20-minute relays over 2.5 hours.
What kind of bombs?
A devastating mix. Primarily incendiaries, designed to start uncontrollable fires alongside high-explosive bombs to destroy buildings and sow panic. The goal wasn't destroying a specific military asset. It was terror, pure and simple, and demonstrating the destructive capacity of modern air power against an urban area.
The message couldn't have been clearer.
Chillingly effective. There is no safe place. Civilian sanctuaries no longer exist in this new kind of war. Total war requires, even demands, that the entire physical, economic, and moral infrastructure of the enemy society is vulnerable, is a legitimate target for destruction.
It worked as a psychological weapon too, presumably.
Immensely so. The Spanish Civil War, and Guernica in particular, offered this horrifying, visible glimpse of what was coming. A conflict where massive mobilization, intense ideological hatred, and the deliberate mass terrorization of non-combatants were all woven together as necessary tools of war.
Which brings us neatly to Section 2, mobilization. The precedents for unrestrained brutality were set, the moral lines blurred. But total war can't just run an ideology in terror. It needs fuel. It needs massive, unprecedented logistical and economic power.
Absolutely. This is where we shift from the The moral breakdown to the nuts and bolts and mechanical reality. World War II, more than any conflict before it, was arguably one on the factory floor, not just the battlefield.
Total war demands total economic commitment.
Total. It requires the complete restructuring of entire national economies. Every resource, steel, oil, rubber, food, every worker, every bit of industrial capacity has to be marshaled and directed toward a single goal: war production.
Let's start with the Soviet Union. They faced the ultimate existential threat with Operation Barbarossa in 1941. Their mobilization seems like perhaps the most complete, the most intense of any nation.
It's certainly arguable that intense, almost fanatical mobilization is what saved the USSR, despite the terrible blows they suffered initially. And it's remarkable because it happened despite the severe political purges of the late 1930s, which had tragically decapitated much of the experienced Red Army leadership.
But their pre-war industrial focus paid off.
Critically, the focus on heavy industry during Stalin's 5-year plans, ruthless as they were, laid the foundation. Think about the speed of change. In 1927, the Soviet Union produced maybe 500 motor vehicles, just 500. By 1940, on the eve of the invasion, that number was 200,000. That industrial base, however inefficient in some ways, allowed them to absorb the initial shock and then ramp up production.
And when the German invasion hit, their response was extraordinary, physically moving factories.
An incredible, almost unbelievable logistical feat, carried out under chaotic, desperate conditions. They dismantled and evacuated over 1,500 major industrial enterprises, almost all geared towards military production, moving them hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles east, beyond the reach of the Wehrmacht, to the Urals, to Siberia.
No workers.
16 million workers were relocated along with the machinery. They were immediately put to work under the harshest conditions imaginable, grueling 11.5-hour days, 6 days a week, often working outdoors in freezing temperatures, living on starvation rations.
Yet production increased.
Astonishingly, yes. Despite losing territory that contained about 40% of their pre-war population and a huge chunk of their industrial capacity, by the end of 1942, Soviet tank and artillery production had actually increased 5-fold compared to the start of the war. That relentless, grinding output was absolutely critical for turning the tide on the Eastern Front.
Okay, let's pivot across the world to the United States.
Yeah.
A nation that starts the war deeply isolationist, wary of getting dragged into another European conflict, and transforms into, well, Roosevelt called it the arsenal of democracy.
A very apt phrase. The U.S. transformation was staggering, perhaps the most potent example of how quickly a modern capitalist economy could be redirected towards war when the political will was there.
How did they manage that pivot so effectively?
It was a combination of factors. First, the sheer underlying industrial might of the U.S. boom during the Depression was enormous. Second, focused government direction. Once the U.S. entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the War Production Board took immediate sweeping control over allocating resources, converting industries, setting production targets.
And the results were just mind-boggling.
The scale is hard to comprehend even now. Look at aircraft. The U.S. produced over 300,000 military aircraft during the war. Germany, a major industrial power, totally geared for war, about 111,000.
Huge difference.
Or tanks. The U.S. churned out over 88,000 tanks. Germany managed around 46,000. It wasn't just the final numbers, it was the speed of conversion and the scale of individual projects.
Like the Willow Run factory.
Exactly. Built by Ford, designed for cars, but rapidly retooled into this enormous mile-long assembly line dedicated solely to producing B-24 Liberator heavy bombers. At its peak, Willow Run was rolling out a completed bomber roughly every hour.
Incredible. But I always think the logistical backbone, maybe less glamorous than bombers, is shown by the trucks.
You're absolutely right. The U.S. produced something like 2.38 million military trucks.
Yeah.
Germany, around 345,000. That difference in sheer mobility, the ability to move troops, supplies, fuel, gave the Allies a massive advantage in every single theater of war.
It fueled that claim from 1943, didn't it? That the U.S. was making a tank every 5 minutes and an aircraft carrier every week. Maybe a bit of an exaggeration, but it captured the spirit.
It captured the reality of relentless, optimized industrial output. They mastered mass production for war.
And this incredible production wasn't just for U.S. forces. It was shared through the Lend-Lease Act.
Yes, Lend-Lease was absolutely vital. Starting even before the U.S. officially entered the war, it allowed the U.S. to supply its allies, primarily Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and about 40 other nations with essential war materials. We're talking about $50 billion worth of assistance, a colossal sum then.
What kind of materials?
Everything. Weapons, aircraft, ships, trucks, food, fuel, raw materials. It essentially enabled nations like Britain, which was financially exhausted by 1941, to keep fighting without facing immediate bankruptcy. Churchill famously called it the most unsorted act in history.
But there was a political and economic angle, too, wasn't there? It wasn't purely altruistic.
Oh, definitely not purely altruistic. While it served the strategic goal of defeating the Axis, the U.S. also shrewdly used Lend-Lease as leverage to reshape the post-war global financial order.
How so?
Well, the agreements tied to Lend-Lease, particularly those negotiated with Britain, included conditions that effectively dismantled the British imperial preference system and paved the way for the U.S. dollar to replace the British pound sterling as the world's dominant reserve currency.
So the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944.
Exactly. Bretton Woods formalized this shift, establishing a post-war financial system centered on the U.S. dollar linked to gold. By essentially forcing Britain to accept these terms in return for vital wartime aid, the U.S. ensured its economic dominance in the post-war world. It was an economic victory secured under the cover of wartime necessity.
Let's shift focus slightly within mobilization to the home front, specifically the role of women's labor. Because here, again, we see a really stark contrast, especially between the Soviets and the Nazis, reflecting their different approaches to total war.
A massive contrast, driven entirely by ideology. In the Soviet Union, ideology dictated that women were, at least in theory, equal partners in the socialist project. So when the war demanded total mobilization, women were drafted into roles previously unheard of.
In the military, too.
Absolutely. Somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million Soviet women served in the military, not just as nurses or clerks, but in active combat roles as snipers, machine gunners, tank drivers, and famously, the pilots of the Night Witches Bomber Regiment, who flew incredibly dangerous night missions in flimsy biplanes.
And in industry.
They became essential. With so many men at the front, women flooded into factories, onto farms. By 1942, for instance, over a quarter of all coal miners in the Soviet Union were women. They were crucial to maintaining production.
Now compare that to Nazi Germany. Their ideology was completely different.
Diametrically opposed, really. The Nazi ideal for women was summed up in the slogan, Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. Their place was in the home, producing racially pure Aryan children for the Reich.
Which seems completely counterproductive in a total war scenario requiring maximum labor.
It was a profound strategic blunder born from ideological rigidity. Hitler and the Nazi leadership were actually quite wary of full economic mobilization impacting the home front too severely.
Why the hesitation?
They feared that harsh rationing, long factory hours for women could destroy civilian morale and maybe even lead to the kind of domestic unrest that helped bring down the Kaiser in 1918. They remembered that collapse.
So German women weren't mobilized to the same extent.
Not even close. The number of women in the German workforce barely increased throughout the war. It went from about 14.6 million in 1939 to only 14.8 million in 1944. German women were largely shielded from the harshest demands of war production until the very end, when it was far too late.
So if German women weren't filling the labor gap created by men going to the front, how did the Nazi war machine keep running? Where did the workers come from?
This is where the Nazi mobilization story takes its darkest turn. They compensated for their self-imposed labor shortage through massive, systematic coercion and exploitation. Forced labor.
How many people are we talking about?
By the end of 1944, Germany was relying on approximately 8 million forced laborers. 8 million. That accounted for roughly 1/3 of their entire labor force.
Where do these people come from?
All over occupied Europe. Prisoners of war, particularly Soviets, workers drafted, often forcibly, from countries like France and Belgium, but the most brutal treatment was reserved for those seized from Eastern Europe, particularly the Soviet Union.
These were the OST arbiters, the Eastern workers.
Yes. The Ostarbeiter system was explicitly based on Nazi racial hierarchy. These workers, mainly Slavs, were considered racially inferior, subhuman, Untermenschen. They were subjected to incredibly harsh conditions and suppressive rules, far worse than workers from Western Europe.
What were those conditions like?
They were often housed in specific forced labor camps, frequently located right next to major German industrial plants, think Krupp, IG Farben, BMW. They had to wear a distinctive cloth badge, an OST symbol marking them out. Their lives were relentless hard labor, minimal food that amounted to starvation rations, appalling sanitation, and constant threat of violence.
So Germany was literally fueling a significant part of its war economy with slave labor, drawn from the very populations it was simultaneously trying to exterminate in the East.
Precisely. It's the chilling logic of Nazi total war. Exploit the inferior races for labor while simultaneously planning their eventual destruction. It perfectly encapsulates the intersection of economic necessity and genocidal ideology.
That economic exploitation, that slave labor system, sets a horrifying context for the ideological war fought on the Eastern Front. But before we dive deep into that, let's swing back to the West for a moment and look at the sheer logistical challenge and ingenuity of D-Day.
Okay, yes. D-Day, June 6, 1944. This was the great Allied gamble, the absolute necessity of opening a major second front in Western Europe to relieve pressure on the Soviets and ultimately crush Nazi Germany.
But it couldn't just be a straightforward assault, could it? They'd learned hard lessons before.
Very hard lessons. The disastrous Dieppe raid in August 1942 was crucial. A mostly Canadian force attempted a direct assault on the occupied French port of Dieppe. It was a catastrophe, over 3,000 killed, wounded, or captured within hours.
The key lesson being,
Never, ever try a frontal assault directly onto a heavily defended, occupied port. The Germans would have it fortified, zeroed in. It was suicide.
so for the main invasion, they needed a different location, and they needed to trick the Germans about where it would be.
Exactly. Two huge challenges. Find a suitable landing zone away from a major port and implement a massive deception plan. The planning, led by figures like British General Frederick Morgan, eventually settled on the beaches of Normandy.
Why Normandy?
It was within range of fighter aircraft based in England. The beaches were suitable for landing large numbers of troops, and it offered access to the French interior. But, crucially, it wasn't the most obvious spot.
The Germans expected Calais.
Overwhelmingly, yes. Pas de Calais is the shortest crossing point across the English Channel, the most direct route to Germany. So the Allies launched Operation Fortitude, perhaps the most successful large-scale deception in military history.
How did Fortitude work?
It was multi-layered. They created a whole Phantom Army group, the first U.S. Army group, FUSAG, supposedly based in Kent, opposite Calais, commanded by the famous General George Patton, whom the Germans respected and feared.
Phantom Army.
Literally. Inflatable tanks and trucks, wooden aircraft, fake radio traffic simulating massive troop movements, double agents feeding misinformation to German intelligence. Everything was designed to convince the Germans that the main assault had to be at Calais and that any landing elsewhere, like Normandy, was merely a diversion, a feint.
And it worked.
Brilliantly. The Germans kept significant forces, including crucial panzer divisions, waiting in the Calais region, convinced the real invasion was still coming there even after the Normandy landings began.
Okay, so they chose Normandy. They fooled the Germans about the location. But they still faced the problem from Dieppe. How do you supply a massive invasion force without capturing a major port immediately?
This is where the sheer ingenuity comes in. If you can't capture a port, you build your own.
Build your own port. How?
The Mulberries. Two enormous artificial harbors, prefabricated in Britain and towed across the channel in sections. It was an incredible feat of engineering.
What do they consist of?
Giant, hollow, reinforced concrete boxes called caissons. Some were huge, 60 feet high. They were floated across, then sunk in precise locations offshore to form breakwaters, creating sheltered anchorages. Then, floating steel roadways, codenamed whales, linked to pierheads called spuds that could rise and fall with the tide, allowing ships to unload directly onto trucks.
Just astonishing. Creating harbors from scratch. And the fuel supply.
Yeah.
An army runs on fuel.
Another critical challenge, another ingenious solution, PLUTO, pipeline under the ocean.
Seriously, an underwater pipeline.
Yes. Actually, multiple pipelines. They developed special, flexible, high-pressure armored pipes that could be coiled onto giant floating drums called conundrums and literally unreeled across the channel seabed by cable-laying ships. These pipes started pumping millions of gallons of fuel almost immediately after the beaches were secured.
And they managed to hide the onshore infrastructure.
With incredible creativity, the main pumping station on the Isle of Wight coordinating the flow was disguised. You won't believe this. It was camouflaged to look like a rundown seaside ice cream parlor, complete with faded paintwork, fake signs advertising ice cream and refreshments, all to hide the massive pumps and machinery vital to the entire invasion.
An ice cream parlor pumping fuel to Normandy. That's brilliant wartime deception. Did the Germans ever figure it out?
Apparently not. Between the success of Operation Fortitude, focusing their attention elsewhere, and the effectiveness of the camouflage and secrecy around Mulberry and PLUTO, these critical logistical elements remained largely undetected until they were operational.
So the Allies have the plan, the location, the deception, the incredible logistics. But success on the day itself still hung in the balance, and German confusion played a big part.
It absolutely did. The timing was crucial. The Allies chose a narrow window of suitable tides and moonlight, but crucially, one that coincided with a period of bad weather in the Channel.
Which caught the Germans off guard.
Completely. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the commander responsible for inspecting and improving the Atlantic Wall defenses, believed the weather was too poor for an invasion. He'd actually left the front to travel back to Germany for his wife's birthday. He was away during the critical initial hours.
And the overall commander, von Rundstedt.
Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the commander-in-chief West, recognized something major was happening, but he faced a critical bottleneck. He needed Hitler's personal permission to release the main panzer reserves, the armored divisions held back for the main counterattack.
And Hitler was asleep.
Famously, yes, Hitler had taken a sleeping draught and gone to bed late. His aides, terrified of his notorious temper, dared not wake him when the first reports from Normandy came in.
So the tanks couldn't move.
The panzer divisions remained frozen in place for several crucial hours during the dawn landings. By the time Hitler finally woke up, learned of the invasion around midday, he was still convinced by the Fortitude deception. He dismissed Normandy as a feint, believing the main attack was still coming at Calais. That delay, that misjudgment, was absolutely fatal for any chance of a swift, decisive German counterattack to throw the Allies back into the sea.
Okay, let's shift our focus now dramatically to the Eastern Front. This was arguably the most brutal, ideologically charged theater of the entire war, where total war meant something even more terrifying: outright annihilation, scorch, and starve tactics.
Yes, the Eastern Front was fundamentally different. Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, wasn't conceived as a traditional military campaign. It was explicitly planned as a Vernichtungskrieg, a war of annihilation.
Driven by Nazi ideology.
Absolutely. Driven by Hitler's obsession with Lebensraum, living space, the plan was to conquer vast territories in the East, eliminate or enslave the existing Slavic populations, seen as racially inferior, destroy Soviet communism, Judeo-Bolshevism in Nazi terms, and then resettle the cleared land with German colonists.
And the military orders issued reflected this genocidal intent from the start. They essentially legalized atrocities.
They did, explicitly. This is a key marker of total war reaching its extreme. Two orders stand out. First, the Martial Jurisdiction Decree. This order effectively removed the actions of German soldiers against Soviet civilians from the jurisdiction of military courts. It gave them carte blanche to murder, rape, and loot without fear of prosecution.
Complete impunity.
Complete impunity. Second, the infamous Commissar Order. This mandated that all captured Soviet political commissars, the Communist Party officials attached to Red Army units, were to be submarined, executed on the spot. No prisoners, no trials. It aimed to destroy the ideological backbone of the Soviet resistance.
So the Germans are waging a war of annihilation. How did the Soviets respond? They employed their own ruthless tactics, didn't they? The scorched earth policy.
Yes. Faced with the speed and brutality of the German advance, Stalin ordered a scorched earth policy. As the Red Army retreated, they were instructed to destroy everything that could possibly be of use to the invaders.
What kind of things?
Roads, bridges, railways, factories, communication lines, fuel depots, even standing crops and livestock. Anything that could feed, shelter, or aid the Wehrmacht was to be torched, demolished, or poisoned.
But the tragic consequence of that
was that it inflicted terrible suffering not just on the advancing Germans, but also on the millions of Soviet civilians who were trapped between the retreating Red Army destroying everything and the advancing Germans who saw them as subhuman obstacles. They were caught in a vice of destruction.
And the Germans took starvation a step further, didn't they? They didn't just benefit from the scorched earth. They formalized mass starvation as actual state policy. The Hunger Plan.
The Hunger Plan, or Der Hunger Plan, is one of the most chilling examples of cold, calculated bureaucratic mass murder in history. It was developed before the invasion, primarily by Herbert Beck, a high-ranking official in the food ministry.
What was his purpose?
Its logic was brutally simple. Germany needed the vast agricultural resources of the Soviet Union, particularly Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe, to feed its own army and civilian population and sustain the war effort. The plan explicitly calculated that diverting this food would inevitably lead to the starvation deaths of millions of Soviet citizens.
And this was accepted, planned for.
It was explicitly planned for and accepted as a necessary consequence. The plan mandated that food supplies from occupied Soviet territories be redirected to Germany. German soldiers and administrators were given direct orders not to feed the local population, even if they were starving.
Were the orders really that blunt?
Incredibly blunt. One directive famously told the army leadership to harden your heart against the sight of starving Russian civilians, stating that any feeling of sympathy was misplaced. Soldiers were forbidden from giving away even a crust of bread.
So the intent was deliberate mass starvation.
Unquestionably. It was a calculated policy tool designed to eliminate millions of useless eaters, clear the land for future German settlement, and secure resources for the Reich. We are talking about premeditated, state-organized famine aimed at killing tens of millions of people. It's genocide through planned starvation.
That chilling level of premeditation, of bureaucratic killing, leads us directly into perhaps the most defining aspect of Nazi total war, the Holocaust. This wasn't just a byproduct of the war, it was a core component, a systematized, industrialized process of murder woven into the fabric of the Nazi state and its war effort.
Absolutely. The Holocaust didn't begin with gas chambers. It started much earlier, with persecution, with the legal stripping away of rights and humanity. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 were a critical early step.
What did they do?
They legally defined who is Jewish based on ancestry, stripped German Jews of their citizenship, and prohibited marriage or relationships between Jews and non-Jewish Germans. It was about legally segregating and marginalizing an entire group.
And this legal persecution was followed by escalating physical violence.
Yes, culminating most notoriously in Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, in November 1938. This was a state-sanctioned pogrom across Germany and Austria.
What happened during Kristallnacht?
Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues were attacked and destroyed. Thousands of Jewish businesses were looted. Nearly 200 synagogues were set ablaze. Jewish cemeteries desecrated. At least 91 Jews were murdered. And crucially, around 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to the first concentration camps at Dachau, Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen.
So Kristallnacht marked a major escalation, normalizing mass arrest and incarceration.
It was a critical turning point. It signaled a shift from sporadic persecution to organized state violence and mass imprisonment. But even then, the plan for systematic extermination hadn't fully formed. Before the final solution could be implemented on its industrial scale, the Nazis conducted a kind of technical rehearsal for mass killing.
And that was the euthanasia program, Action T4.
Exactly. Action T4, starting in 1939. It was rooted in the Nazi ideology of racial purity and eugenics, targeting individuals deemed unworthy of life or useless eaters.
Who did that include initially?
It began with the compulsory reporting and subsequent killing, often by starvation or lethal injection of newborns and infants born with severe congenital illnesses or physical disabilities. Then it expanded rapidly to include adults institutionalized in psychiatric hospitals and asylums.
And this program was where they developed the methods for mass murder.
Precisely. T4 became the laboratory for efficient killing techniques that minimized the psychological burden on the perpetrators. They moved from lethal injection, which was slow and required direct action, to using bottled carbon monoxide gas piped into sealed rooms.
And the infamous gas chambers, disguised as showers.
That originated in the T4 program. Patients were led into rooms designed to look like shower facilities, then gassed. Crucially, the personnel who developed these techniques managed the logistics, operated the gas valves, certified the deaths, disposed of the bodies. Many of these T4 operatives were later transferred directly to occupied Poland to build and run the extermination camps of the final solution. They provided the trained killers and the administrative blueprint for genocide.
While T4 was refining the killing methods, another process was underway in occupied territories, especially Poland, from 1940-41, ghettoization.
Yes, the creation of ghettos was a key intermediate step. Jews across occupied Europe were forcibly removed from their homes and confined into segregated, overcrowded districts within cities and towns. These ghettos were then sealed off, often with walls, barbed wire, and armed guards, isolating the Jewish population completely.
What were conditions like inside? The Warsaw Ghetto is the most infamous example.
Conditions were deliberately engineered to cause mass suffering and death. In Warsaw, the largest ghetto, around 450,000 people were crammed into an area of just 1.3 square miles. Overcrowding was extreme, often 7, 8, 9 people sharing a single small room.
And starvation was used as a weapon here, too.
a deliberate central weapon. Food rations allocated to the ghettos were kept at intentionally lethal levels, sometimes as low as 200 calories per day. Disease typhus, dysentery spread rapidly due to malnutrition, lack of sanitation, and overcrowding. Tens of thousands died from hunger and disease before the deportations to death camps even began.
But the ghettos weren't meant to be permanent, were they?
No, Nazi documents explicitly referred to them as a temporary measure, a transit vehicle. Their purpose was concentration, gathering the Jewish population in manageable locations and attrition, weakening them through starvation and disease, making them easier to control and eventually deport for extermination.
Yet even in these hellish conditions, there was resistance, incredible acts of defiance.
Absolutely. The spirit of resistance never died, even in the face of impossible odds. Cultural life, education, religious observance continued secretly, and there was armed resistance too.
The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising.
The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in April 1943 is the most famous and powerful example. A few hundred, maybe 1,000, poorly armed Jewish fighters, members of groups like the ZOB, Jewish Combat Organization, rose up against the heavily armed German forces who came to liquidate the ghetto to deport the remaining inhabitants to Treblinka.
How long did they hold out?
For 27 days. Using pistols, homemade grenades, Molotov cocktails, fighting from bunkers and rooftops, they held off German tanks, artillery, and SS troops in brutal street fighting. It was an act of astonishing courage, choosing how to die, fighting back against annihilation.
But the outcome was inevitable.
Tragically, yes. The Germans brought in overwhelming force, systematically burning the ghetto building by building, block by block, until it was reduced to rubble. The uprising was crushed, the survivors deported or killed, but its symbolic power, its message of defiance, resonated then and resonates now.
The final, horrifying step. The systematic industrial extermination was formalized at the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, wasn't it?
Yes. Wannsee wasn't where the decision to commit genocide was made. That likely happened earlier, perhaps in late 1941. But Wannsee was the high-level meeting where key SS officials and state secretaries coordinated the administrative details, the logistics, for implementing the final solution of the Jewish question across Europe.
And this led to the construction of dedicated death camps.
6 camps were established in occupied Poland, specifically designed or adapted primarily for mass extermination. Chełmno, Biszek, Sobibor, Treblinka, Majdań, and the largest and most notorious, Auschwitz-Birkenau. These were different from concentration camps like Dachau. Their main purpose wasn't slave labor, it was immediate murder.
Let's focus on Auschwitz-Birkenau as it exemplifies the industrialized process. What happened when transports arrived?
Trains packed with Jewish deportees from all over Europe arrived on the ramp at Birkenau. The doors were unsealed, and they were immediately subjected to the selection process, usually conducted by SS doctors like Josef Mengele.
Selection for what?
Life or death. A quick glance decided their fate. Those deemed fit enough for work, mostly younger men, and some women were selected for slave labor in the vast Auschwitz camp complex or nearby industrial sites. They were usually worked to death within months.
And everyone else?
Children, the elderly, the sick, pregnant women, mothers with young children, anyone deemed unfit for immediate labor were sent directly, immediately to the gas chambers.
They were told they were going for showers.
Often, yes. To maintain order and prevent panic, they were told they needed disinfection, needed to shower. They were forced to undress, herded into large sealed concrete rooms disguised as shower facilities. Then, SS men dropped Zyklon B pellets, a cyanide-based pesticide, through vents in the roof or walls. The pellets released lethal hydrogen cyanide gas, killing everyone inside within minutes, usually 15 to 20 minutes.
The scale. The capacity was designed for mass killing.
The killing machinery at Birkenau was brutally efficient. At its peak, the crematoria could dispose of thousands of bodies a day. The camp complex had a killing capacity estimated at up to 10,000 people per day. It was mass murder on an assembly line.
And chillingly, this entire process was deeply interwoven with the German war economy. It was profitable.
That's a crucial aspect of how total war corrupted everything. The SS actually charged German companies for the use of Jewish slave labor from the camps. Companies like IG Farben built enormous factories nearby specifically to exploit this captive workforce.
And the victims' belongings.
Everything was confiscated and meticulously sorted. Clothing, valuables, suitcases, eyeglasses, even human hair was shaved off and sold for industrial use. Gold fillings were extracted from the teeth of corpses and melted down into bars for the Reich treasury. It was an economy built literally on the plunder of murder victims.
The final numbers are still hard to fully comprehend. 6 million Jews murdered.
6 million Jews. And we must never forget the millions of other victims targeted by the Nazi regime for racial, political, or social reasons. Roma and Sinti people, gypsies, Soviet prisoners of war, Polish and other Slavic civilians, political opponents, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, people with disabilities. The scale of the killing was vast.
And perhaps one of the most disturbing questions is, how much did the Allies know and when?
The evidence is clear that detailed reports about the systematic nature of the extermination campaign, including the use of gas chambers and the sheer numbers being killed, reached Allied governments in London and Washington, primarily through Polish and Jewish resistance sources by late 1942 and certainly throughout 1943 and 1944.
But little was done specifically to target the killing centers, like bombing Auschwitz.
That remains a painful point of historical debate. The Allies argue that the best way to save the victims was to win the war as quickly as possible. They prioritized military targets. Requests to bomb the railway lines leading to Auschwitz or the gas chambers themselves were rejected, often citing technical difficulties or the need to focus resources elsewhere. It seems clear in retrospect that they failed to fully grasp two things. First, the sheer priority the Nazis gave to the genocide, dedicating vast resources to it even as they were losing the war. And second, perhaps, a failure of imagination, an inability to fully comprehend the industrial scale and unique nature of the horror until the camps were actually liberated.
That liberation, when it finally came, revealed the full truth. Which brings us to the transition, a difficult one, from the horrors in Europe to the escalating, incredibly brutal conflict in the Pacific theater. A different kind of total war, perhaps, defined by vast distances, island hopping, and a unique fanatical resistance.
Yes, the Pacific War had its own distinct characteristics. The geography alone, the immense stretches of ocean, the thousands of islands presented enormous logistical challenges. And early on, around 1943, the U.S. military leadership was actually divided on the best strategy to defeat Japan.
What were the competing strategies?
There were essentially two main camps. General Douglas MacArthur, the Army commander who had famously vowed, "I shall return to the Philippines," advocated for a land-based approach. He wanted to advance northward from the Southwest Pacific, capturing large islands like New Guinea and, crucially, liberating the Philippines to cut Japan off from its vital resource supplies in Southeast Asia.
And the other strategy?
The Navy, led by Admiral Chester Nimitz, favored a more direct island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific. The idea was to bypass heavily fortified Japanese strongholds that weren't strategically essential, and instead seize smaller islands, atolls, often that could be used as forward bases for air power and submarines, getting progressively closer to Japan itself.
So two different paths towards Tokyo. Who won that debate?
Initially, MacArthur's powerful personality and his deep emotional commitment to returning to the Philippines swayed President Roosevelt. So, the Philippines campaign became a major focus first, although elements of the island-hopping strategy were pursued concurrently.
But regardless of the specific path, the nature of the fighting in the Pacific quickly became apparent. It was going to be incredibly bloody, wasn't it? Tarawa seems like a key early example.
Tarawa, in the Gilbert Islands, November 1943. It was a terrible, brutal initiation into the reality of amphibious assaults against heavily fortified Japanese positions.
What went wrong there?
Several things. Faulty intelligence about the tides and the coral reef surrounding the island meant that the landing craft couldn't get over the reef. They grounded hundreds of yards offshore.
So Marines had to wade ashore.
Yes, under intense direct fire from well-dug-in Japanese defenders. Machine guns, mortars, artillery, they were completely exposed, wading through chest-deep water. The casualties were horrific, especially on the first day. Out of about 5,000 Marines who landed on the first day, roughly 1,500 were killed or severely wounded. A 30% casualty rate in just hours. It shocked the American public back home seeing the newsreel footage. But Tarawa also revealed something deeply disturbing about the enemy.
The Japanese refusal to surrender.
Exactly. That became the defining characteristic of the Pacific Land War. Of the approximately 4,200 Japanese troops defending Tarawa, only 1717 were captured alive. The vast majority fought literally to the last man or took their own lives rather than surrender.
Driven by their military code.
Driven by the warrior code of Bushido, which emphasized death before dishonor and intense indoctrination portraying surrender as the ultimate shame. Tarawa sent a chilling message to the U.S. Every island, every position would likely have to be taken by exterminating the defenders. There would be no easy victories.
This escalating brutality, combined with the strategic importance of the Philippines, led to one of the biggest naval battles in history. Leak Gulf, October 1944.
Lake Gulf was enormous, complex, and desperate for the Japanese. They threw almost everything they had left into one incredibly complicated gamble, Operation Shogo, or Victory Operation.
What was the plan?
It involved multiple Japanese naval forces converging on the U.S. invasion fleet supporting MacArthur's landings at Leyte in the Philippines. The most daring part was the use of their remaining aircraft carriers, 4 of them, but critically with very few aircraft or trained pilots left as a decoy.
A decoy to lure away the main American fleet.
Precisely. They sent this northern force, the carriers, south from Japan, hoping to draw away Admiral William Bull, Halsey's powerful U.S. Third Fleet, the main American carrier strike force.
Yeah, Halsey took the bait.
He did. Halsey, eager to sink the last Japanese carriers, fell for the decoy completely and steamed north with his entire fleet in pursuit, leaving the U.S. landing beaches at Leyte dangerously exposed.
They're supposed to.
Exposed to the powerful Japanese center force, commanded by Admiral Kurita, which included the super battleship Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, and several other heavy warships. This force slipped through the San Bernardino Strait undetected and bore down on the vulnerable American landing support group.
Which only had small ships to defend it.
Exactly. The group protecting the landings, codenamed Taffy 3, consisted only of small, slow escort carriers, jeep carriers, destroyers, and even smaller destroyer escorts. They were completely outgunned, facing battleships with destroyers.
How did they possibly survive?
It was one of the most heroic and desperate naval actions of the war. The destroyers and destroyer escorts of Taffy 3 charged the massive Japanese ships, launching torpedoes, firing their small guns, laying smoke screens, trying desperately to disrupt the attack and protect their vulnerable carriers. The escort carriers launched their planes, attacking with bombs, torpedoes, even strafing runs. But ultimately, salvation came from Japanese confusion. Admiral Kurita, despite having victory within his grasp, became convinced he was sailing into a trap, fearing Halsey's main fleet was about to pounce. His ships had taken some damage, communication was poor, and he controversially ordered his powerful force to turn around and retreat, just as they were about to annihilate Taffy 3.
A miraculous escape for the Americans, but a disaster for the Japanese Navy.
Leyte Gulf effectively finished the Imperial Japanese Navy as a major fighting force. They lost the 4 decoy carriers in the north, in what was dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot earlier by Halsey's pilots, though that term is more accurately for the Battle of the Philippine Sea. 3 battleships, including the giant Musashi, and numerous cruisers and destroyers. Critically, they lost most of their remaining experienced pilots.
And with their conventional navy crippled, Japan turned to even more desperate measures. The kamikazes.
Yes. The kamikaze divine wind suicide attacks began in earnest during the Philippines campaign, right after the Leyte Gulf disaster. Organized units of pilots deliberately crashing their bomb-laden aircraft into Allied warships.
A tactic born of desperation, but also ideology.
Both. It reflected the dire military situation, the lack of trained pilots and modern aircraft, but it was also deeply rooted in the Japanese military code, emphasizing self-sacrifice for the emperor, the idea that death in battle was honorable, while surrender was unthinkable. Kamikazes inflicted significant damage and heavy casualties on the U.S. Navy, and psychologically they underscored the fanatical nature of the resistance the Allies faced as they moved closer to Japan.
And the island invasions that followed, Leyte Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, they just confirmed the horrific cost of overcoming this fanaticism, didn't they?
They became progressively bloodier, embodying the grim calculus of the Pacific War. Saipan was particularly horrifying because it involved large numbers of Japanese civilians.
What happened there?
Influenced by Japanese military propaganda depicting Americans as brutal monsters who would torture and kill prisoners, thousands of Japanese civilians on Saipan chose mass suicide rather than surrender as U.S. forces advanced. Whole families jumped to their deaths from cliffs. It was a shocking demonstration of the extent of Japanese indoctrination and fear. Then came Iwo Jima, February-March 1945. A tiny volcanic island, but strategically important for its airfields. The battle was pure hell.
The casualties were immense.
Nearly 7,000 U.S. Marines were killed and another 20,000 wounded to capture an island just 8 square miles. They had to root out some 22,000 deeply entrenched Japanese defenders from caves and tunnels. Only about 200 Japanese survived to be captured. Iwo Jima became a potent symbol of the anticipated bloodbath if the U.S. had to invade the Japanese home islands.
And Okinawa even worse.
Okinawa, the last major battle, from April to June 1945, was the deadliest campaign of the Pacific War for the Americans. Over 12,000 Americans killed, nearly 50,000 wounded. Japanese military losses were over 100,000 killed, and horrifically, an estimated 100,000 to 150,000 Okinawan civilians also died, caught in the crossfire, forced into combat, or committing suicide.
These battles seem to prove that invading Japan itself, Operation Downfall, would be catastrophic.
The projected casualty figures for invading Kyushu and Honshu were staggering. Estimates varied, but many planners feared American casualties alone could reach 250,000, perhaps 500,000, or even more. Japanese casualties would be in the millions, including civilians expected to resist with bamboo spears.
This terrifying prospect led the U.S. to intensify its air war against Japan, shifting tactics again.
Yes. Precision bombing of industrial targets from high altitude had proven largely ineffective in Japan due to factors like persistent cloud cover, strong jet stream winds, and the dispersed nature of Japanese industry, often small workshops in residential areas.
So they switched to area bombing with incendiaries, like the British tactics over Germany.
Exactly. General Curtis LeMay, head of the exile-agreed Bomber Command, made a decisive shift. Recognizing that Japanese cities were predominantly built of wood and paper, he ordered his B-29 superfortresses to fly lower, at night, and drop massive loads of incendiary bombs, aiming to create uncontrollable firestorms.
The Tokyo firebombing of March 10, 1945 was the most devastating example.
It was horrific. Hundreds of B-29s dropped incendiaries on Tokyo. A massive firestorm erupted, engulfing nearly 16 square miles of the densely populated city. The heat was so intense it created its own winds. Estimates suggest around 100,000 civilians were killed in that single raid, mostly by fire or suffocation, and over 1 million were left homeless. It was, in terms of immediate deaths, possibly more destructive than either atomic bombing.
So the U.S. was now fully employing total war tactics against Japanese civilians, hoping to break their will to resist and avoid the invasion.
That was the strategic logic, however brutal. The firebombing campaign continued against dozens of other Japanese cities. But even this immense destruction didn't force an immediate surrender from the Japanese leadership. Which brings us to the final, terrible climax of the war. The estimated cost of invasion remained unacceptably high in President Truman's view, and the U.S. now possessed a new weapon of unprecedented power, developed in utmost secrecy.
The atomic bomb, the Manhattan Project.
The successful test of the first atomic bomb in New Mexico in July 1945 presented Truman with a radical, horrifying alternative to invasion.
But the decision to use it remains hugely controversial. We mentioned the casualty estimates for invasion, but wasn't there significant dissent within the U.S. military and scientific communities about using the bomb, especially without warning, against cities? Weren't there arguments that Japan was already beaten and seeking surrender terms?
That's absolutely central to the ongoing debate, and yes, there was dissent. High-ranking military figures like General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander in Europe, and Admiral William Leahy, Truman's chief of staff, later expressed strong reservations. Leahy called the bomb a barbarous weapon and argued Japan was already defeated through the naval blockade and conventional bombing. Some scientists involved in the Manhattan Project also argued for a demonstration explosion on an unpopulated area first to show its power without causing mass civilian casualties. There were diplomatic feelers suggesting Japan might surrender if the position of the emperor could be guaranteed.
But Truman decided otherwise.
Truman, advised heavily by figures like Secretary of State James Burns and deeply concerned about American casualties in an invasion, chose to use the bomb. The desire to end the war quickly, perhaps also to impress the Soviet Union with America's new power, likely played roles.
So, Hiroshima, August 6, 1945.
The B-29 Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb, Little Boy, on Hiroshima. The immediate blast, heat, and firestorm killed somewhere between 35,000 and 50,000 people instantly. Many tens of thousands more would die later from horrific burns and radiation sickness.
And when Japan still didn't surrender immediately.
3 days later, on August 9th, the second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. On the same day, the Soviet Union, honoring its agreement made at the Yalta Conference, declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion of Japanese-occupied Manchuria, quickly overwhelming the Kwantan Army.
Japan's position was now completely hopeless.
Utterly untenable. Yet even then, the Japanese War Cabinet was paralyzed, deadlocked. 3 members, including the Prime Minister, Baron Suzuki, favored accepting the Allied demand for unconditional surrender with the sole implicit condition of retaining the emperor. The other 3, representing the hardline military factions, wanted to fight on, perhaps hoping for one last honorable battle or slightly better terms.
So it took an unprecedented intervention to break the deadlock.
Yes. In an extraordinary move, Emperor Hirohito personally intervened. Summoning the cabinet, he stated his wish for peace, accepting the Allied terms. He instructed them to endure the unendurable and suffer what is insufferable. His decision, broadcast, albeit in formal court language, to the Japanese people for the first time ever, was decisive.
And the formal surrender followed soon after.
Japan announced its acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration terms on August 15th, leading to VJ Day celebrations worldwide. The formal surrender documents were signed aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945. The most destructive war in human history, the ultimate total war, was finally over.
Over, but leaving behind a world utterly transformed, scarred, and facing immediate new challenges. The aftermath of total war wasn't peace. It was shock, retribution, displacement, and the immediate seeds of the next global conflict.
Absolutely. We have to talk about the aftermath, starting with the liberation of the concentration and death camps. The full horror was finally revealed.
The Soviets liberated Auschwitz in January 1945. What did they find?
Evidence of industrialized murder on a scale that defied imagination. Gas chambers, crematoria still operating, vast warehouses filled with human hair, eyeglasses, shoes, suitcases, the belongings of millions, and thousands of emaciated survivors.
And the Western Allies encountered similar horrors.
Yes. When British forces liberated Bergen-Belsen in April 1945, they found scenes of unbelievable squalor and death. Around 60,000 to 70,000 prisoners were alive, but typhus and starvation were rampant. Piles of unburied corpses lay everywhere. Despite immediate medical aid, about 10,000 prisoners died in the first 3 weeks after liberation. They were simply too far gone. The newsreels and photographs from Belsen and other camps like Dachau and Buchenwald shocked the world and brought the reality of Nazi barbarity home.
This revelation of absolute horror must have fueled a desire for immediate justice, or perhaps revenge, across liberated Europe.
It certainly did. Liberation was followed swiftly by often brutal summary retribution against collaborators or those perceived to have sided with the occupiers.
Particularly in France.
France saw widespread acts of popular vengeance. Men accused of collaboration might be beaten or executed without trial. Women accused of horizontal collaboration, having sexual relationships with German soldiers, faced particularly degrading public humiliation. Their heads were often shaved, they might be stripped, daubed with swastikas, tarred and feathered, and paraded through the streets.
This created deep divisions within French society afterwards, didn't it? This idea of divided memory.
Yes, the mémoire divisée. It refers to the lasting tension between different post-war narratives. On one hand, the heroic, unifying narrative of the resistance. On the other, the often more complex, painful memories of occupation, collaboration, accommodation, and particularly the trauma experienced by communities subjected to collective German reprisals.
Like in Toul.
Exactly. In Toul, after a resistance attack, the SS hanged 99 randomly selected male civilians from lampposts and balconies as a reprisal. The memory of that collective suffering, that vulnerability, coexisted uneasily with the later triumphant narrative of resistance and liberation. The scars of occupation ran very deep and weren't easily healed. And tragically, the violence didn't just flow from the liberated against the collaborators. The victorious Allied armies themselves were involved in atrocities during and immediately after the liberation.
We have evidence documenting this, sadly.
Yes, undeniably. The scale of rape committed by Red Army soldiers as they advanced through Eastern Europe and into Germany, particularly Berlin, was horrific and widespread. But it wasn't limited to the Soviets. Historians have also documented significant numbers of rapes and other crimes committed by American, British, and French soldiers in occupied territories, particularly Germany and France. The breakdown of discipline and the brutalizing effect of war took a toll on all sides, although the scale and nature differed.
Amidst this chaos and desire for retribution, the Allies attempted to establish a more formal, legal process for dealing with the unprecedented crimes committed, the war crimes trials.
Nuremberg and Tokyo. These were landmark events, genuinely historic attempts to apply international law to the leaders of defeated aggressor nations. They aimed to establish individual accountability for state actions.
And they introduced new legal concepts.
3 fundamentally new categories of crime under international law were prosecuted. Crimes against peace, essentially planning and waging aggressive war crimes, violations of the traditional laws and customs of war, and the entirely novel concept of crimes against humanity.
Crimes against humanity, what did that cover?
This was designed to address the systematic persecution and murder of civilians by their own government, like the Holocaust. It covered acts like murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, committed against any civilian population before or during the war.
But these new legal concepts, especially crimes against peace, faced criticism at the time, didn't they? Accusations of victor's justice.
They absolutely did. A major criticism, particularly leveled against the charge of crimes against peace, was that it constituted ex post facto law, meaning the law was created or defined after the actions had taken place and then applied retroactively. Critics argued this violated fundamental principles of justice, that you shouldn't be tried for something that wasn't explicitly illegal under international law when you did it. Figures like U.S. Supreme Court Justice Harlan Fiske privately called the Nuremberg trials a high-grade lynching party, reflecting this concern about legal legitimacy versus political expediency. While the trials were arguably essential for establishing a record, providing some measure of accountability, and perhaps preventing endless cycles of revenge, they also represented a contested and revolutionary moment in legal history.
Beyond justice, the end of the war created another immediate massive problem: refugees. Millions of people displaced.
A colossal humanitarian crisis. Millions of displaced persons, DPs, across Europe and Asia, former slave laborers, concentration camp survivors, prisoners of war, ethnic Germans expelled from Eastern Europe, people fleeing the advance of the Red Army. They needed shelter, food, medical care, and ultimately repatriation or resettlement.
And the international response led to the development of modern refugee law.
Yes, the need to manage this crisis spurred the creation of international organizations and the first frameworks for international refugee law. But this process immediately became politicized by the emerging Cold War.
How so? The definition of a legitimate refugee became ideological.
Very quickly, yes. The early definitions adopted by Western powers tended to prioritize those fleeing communism. If you could demonstrate you were escaping persecution from a communist regime, you were more likely to be recognized as a legitimate political refugee deserving of international protection and resettlement. If your displacement was due to the war's general devastation, or you were fleeing from a non-communist area, you might be classified merely as an economic migrant, or simply told to return home, even if home no longer existed or was unsafe. Suffering became filtered through an ideological lens.
And this emerging Cold War context also drove economic policy, like the Marshall Plan.
The Marshall Plan is the prime example. Officially the European Recovery Program, launched in 1948. The U.S. pumped about $13 billion, a huge sum, into rebuilding the economies of 17 Western European nations.
Was it purely humanitarian?
Humanitarian concerns played a role, certainly, but the primary motivation was strategic and deeply rooted in the Cold War. The U.S. feared that economic collapse, poverty, and desperation in Western Europe would make those countries vulnerable to communist takeovers, either internally or through Soviet influence.
So rebuild economies to prevent communism.
Exactly. Create economic stability, foster democratic institutions, tie Western Europe tightly to the U.S.-led capitalist system. It was also, not coincidentally, hugely beneficial to the U.S. economy, creating massive markets for American exports and cementing U.S. economic leadership.
And finally, the very agreements that ended the war essentially baked in the division of the world that would define the next half-century.
The seeds of the Cold War were sown immediately in the post-war settlements. Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones: U.S., British, French, and Soviet, which rapidly solidified into West Germany and East Germany, the front line of the Cold War in Europe.
And in Asia.
Korea, liberated from Japanese rule, was temporarily divided at the 38th parallel into Soviet and U.S. occupation zones. That temporary division became permanent and led directly to the Korean War just 5 years later. The very weapon that had ended World War II with such devastating finality, the atomic bomb, now cast a permanent shadow, creating the specter of nuclear annihilation and ushering in a completely new, terrifying era of global confrontation.
It's overwhelming to contemplate. This entire deep dive really underscores that total war wasn't just a bigger war. It was fundamentally different. It demanded, and it received, the total mortgaging of entire societies, their economies, their workforces, the lives of their civilians, even their core morality, all sacrificed on the altar of victory on a scale humanity had simply never witnessed before. Every boundary was systematically dismantled and erased.
And when you look at the long-term human cost, the aftermath, the moral inversions are just staggering. Think about the perpetrators. Many administrators, bureaucrats, even some direct participants in horrific crimes managed to fade back into society, sometimes quite easily. Some found new usefulness, new protection during the Cold War. Their lives often returned to a semblance of normality, sometimes with near complete impunity.
While the survivors
The survivors carried the trauma forever, Consider the Hibakusha, the survivors of the atomic bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They endured not only the unimaginable immediate horror and physical injuries, but also decades of radiation-related illnesses like leukemia and profound social stigma and discrimination within Japan itself. They were living symbols of the war's terrifying conclusion, bearing invisible, lifelong scars, while many who orchestrated the global suffering perhaps slept more soundly.
That disparity, that enduring trauma versus the often muted consequences for perpetrators is perhaps the ultimate tragedy and the enduring lesson we have to grapple with from this period. We have to internalize this knowledge, no matter how deeply uncomfortable it is, to keep it part of our active, collective memory.
There's a quote from one of the historical sources that really struck me, something to the effect of, "The problem with lessons of history is that they have no power unless there are those prepared to teach and those willing to learn."
A powerful and perhaps sobering final thought. Be willing to learn. Keep this knowledge, this difficult history alive. Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive.